Carlos Sainz came into the 2022 Formula 1 season with the ambition of becoming Ferrari's spearhead. He didn't say that, of course, he's too intelligent a team player for that, but after outscoring teammate Charles Leclerc in 2021, staying on top would be the objective for any serious racing driver. But it just hasn't worked out for Sainz. After spinning into the gravel on the second lap of the Australian Grand Prix, he watched from the pit wall as Leclerc made it 2 wins out of 3 with victory in Melbourne to take a commanding World Championship lead. Sainz is now 38 points behind Leclerc. That's not an insurmountable gap to close by any means, but Sainz's Australia disaster followed races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia where he was well beaten by Leclerc. Far from being Ferrari's title shot, Sainz now risks being cast as Leclerc's wingman as a result. Sainz's Australian Grand Prix weekend was going pretty well until Q3. On his first Q3 run, Sainz was on a lap that was within half a tenth of Leclerc's provisional pole position time and just metres away from the finish when the session was red flagged for Fernando Alonso's crash. Even if he had gone fastest with that lap, he'd have needed to improve on the second run anyway, but it meant he couldn't set a banker time. But when the session was restarted, a problem firing up the car meant Sainz didn't leave the pit lane until there was 3 minutes and 3 seconds remaining. He could only use the outlap to warm up the tyres before committing to a flying lap rather than the 2 preparation laps required. As a result, the car was all over the place thanks to a lack of grip, and he ended up 9th, 1.5 seconds slower than Leclerc and ahead only of Alonso, who didn't set a time. Sainz described Q3 as a disaster and admitted to being angry. But he still had a faster car for the race and vowed to be aggressive. Given the pace of the Ferrari, with a good start, a big result was still on the cards. But just over 2 minutes before the start of the formation lap, Sainz spotted a problem. He told the team that the brake balance button on the steering wheel wasn't working. This led to Ferrari changing it, despite Sainz's suggestion to leave it, as he was reluctant to have a different steering wheel for the start. Unfortunately, the start map setting on the replacement steering wheel was incorrect. As Ferrari team principal Mattia Binotto later admitted in response to a question from the race, this shouldn't have been the case and the start map should have been identical. But as a result, the car went into anti-stall both for the start of the formation lap and the race start itself. Sainz dropped to 13th immediately. Sainz's impatience to recover then got the better of him. His attempt to pass Yuki Tsunoda's AlphaTauri around the outside of turn 11 led to him running wide, allowing Haas driver Mick Schumacher to pass him. He then made the ill-fated decision to pass Schumacher on the outside approaching the high-speed turn 9 on lap 2. He was ahead into the corner, but with Valtteri Bottas's Alfa Romeo just ahead of him, the car became unstable and he ran onto the grass. Sainz tried to keep it under control, but couldn't, and spun back across the track, ending up in the turn 10 gravel trap. The other problems were beyond Sainz's control, but after the poor start, he admitted to responding badly and that he needed to be hard on himself. This was certainly the worst race of Sainz's Ferrari career, which has by and large been strong since he joined the team in 2021. You can even make a good case for it being the worst of his 143 starts in F1. Yes, there have been times where mechanical problems have ruined his race, and like all F1 drivers, he's made his fair share of mistakes, most memorably clattering Lance Stroll's Williams at Turn 1 in Bahrain in 2017 in a bafflingly ill-judged attempt to pass him after coming out of the pits. But for a driver who is usually so calculating, it was a rare example of Sainz losing his head. Sainz made all the usual comments about learning from the mistakes and coming back stronger, but his nightmare race could have big repercussions for him if it does shore up Leclerc's status as Ferrari's title shot. More on Sainz in a moment, but first, thanks for watching. If you're enjoying it, hit the like button, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe so that you never miss anything from the race. Your support is what allows us to do what we do, and we've got plenty in the pipeline for you to watch in terms of coverage of F1 in 2022. Sainz started the season with a difficult weekend in Bahrain. He may have finished second behind Leclerc and qualified just 0.126 seconds slower than him in third, but Sainz described that as the most difficult weekend of my Ferrari career. You could argue that Australia has now replaced that, but in Bahrain, Sainz was ill at ease with the car and felt Leclerc had a clear advantage in terms of pace, driving style and tyre management. It was a similar story in Saudi Arabia, where Sainz finished third behind old teammate Max Verstappen and Leclerc. There, Sainz had taken provisional pole position on the first runs in Q3 on used rubber, but he couldn't extract the same performance from fresh softs as Leclerc could. It's clear that Sainz hasn't taken to the Ferrari F175 as well as Leclerc has. During testing, Leclerc talked regularly about how much he'd had to adapt to the car, particularly with the way he approached the braking zones and corner entry. It has taken longer for Sainz to get to grips with it. Already it was clear after those first two races that Sainz was at risk of falling permanently into Leclerc's shadow. But what made the Australian Q3 and race disasters so frustrating was that he felt he was getting more on top of the car. He genuinely had a shot at pole position had qualifying panned out better, and that would have transformed his race. But these are the fine lines between triumph and disaster that face all F1 drivers. Sainz felt he'd made significant progress with the car in Australia before his various setbacks. That's why he was so frustrated that a weekend he hoped might turn around his season went so badly wrong. While Sainz has struggled, Leclerc has barely put a foot wrong in 2022. He won from pole position in Bahrain, fighting off Verstappen in the process, then finished a fighting second to the Red Bull driver in Saudi Arabia, having led much of the race. Australia brought a second pole position and the most dominant win of the season so far. This is bad news for Sainz. While Ferrari has a policy of equal opportunity for its drivers in terms of equipment and opportunity where possible, it's only natural that any team will galvanise around the stronger driver. Binotto has always brushed aside the suggestion that Sainz was brought in as a support act to Leclerc. However, after the difficulties Ferrari had with Sebastian Vettel alongside Leclerc in 2019, remember their Interlagos collision and the various team orders controversies, Ferrari saw Sainz as the ideal number two. Fast, consistent, accomplished, professional, but not quite as fast as Leclerc. That deal was done before the belated start to the 2020 season. As Binotto admitted at the end of that year, Sainz had raised his qualifying game during the season. Tellingly, he also stressed Sainz's value in the hunt for the Constructors' Championship. But Sainz proved to be more than just a support act. He took a rigorous approach to his integration at Ferrari, spending plenty of time at Maranello over the winter ahead of the 2021 season, and was the most convincing of all the drivers who changed teams that year in terms of his immediate performance level. Most significantly, he achieved slightly better race results than Leclerc, with 4 podium finishes, and beat him to 5th in the championship by 5.5 points. Sainz also outpaced Leclerc in 4 out of the final 6 qualifying sessions, raising expectations that he might be able to outperform him consistently in 2022, even though Leclerc was, on average, just under a tenth of a second faster over the season. That said, luck had played a part in Sainz outscoring Leclerc, and the race's top 10 drivers still had Leclerc ranked ahead of Sainz given his underlying performance advantage. But Sainz's hopes of building on that first season have been dealt a blow by how 2022 has panned out. Leclerc is on form, at one with the car and has a big championship lead, so it's only natural the team will get behind him. There is still time for Sainz to turn things round, as Binotto has said, but it rings somewhat hollow given the Spaniard is now filling exactly the role Ferrari signed him for. With Leclerc's title rival, Max Verstappen, being clear number 1 at Red Bull with teammate Sergio Perez his wingman, this is no bad thing for Ferrari. Sainz is an excellent driver, one capable of taking points off Verstappen and will bring in plenty of points for the Constructors' Championship. But as so many who have gone up against drivers like Leclerc have learned the hard way, once you are cast as number 2 based on performance, it can be very difficult to break out of that. That's perhaps why Sainz lost his head in his desperation to recover from the bad start in Australia, and it's why he will be determined to hit back as soon as possible in order to be seen as a potential title threat. If, that is, it's not already too late.